There are a number of different themes that recur throughout the study of biology. In this part of the lesson, we're going to discuss 5 of those themes that kind of unify a lot of biological ideas. The first theme that we'll discuss is evolution. Evolution is what we call the core theme of biology. Okay, as we said back in part 1, life is distinguished by unity and diversity, and the explanation of this is evolution. Okay, this is the process of change that has transformed life from its earliest forms to the numerous and varying forms that we have today. And that's just what that means, is that organisms have changed over time. A lot of our understanding of how evolution works is due to the ideas and work of Charles Darwin. He was an English naturalist in the 19th century who observed changes in organisms and realized there were natural processes at work. We call this evolution by natural selection. He observed that within populations of the same species there were variations that were inheritable. Okay. Also, many organisms tend to overproduce. They produce a lot more offspring than can survive. And so as a result, that you can infer from that if there are some members of the species whose variations make them more likely to be successful in their environment, those ones are more likely to survive and have more reproductive success. Over time, they're going to pass those traits to their offspring, and that will lead to change in the species over a period of time. Here's an example, okay? We have a population of beetles here with varied traits. Some of them are very light in color. Some of them are kind of medium colored. Some are darker, okay? If there were a predator, if they lived in this dark background and there were a predator like a bird that preyed on them, you would see that the bird would more likely eat the lighter colored ones because they're more visible. Okay, that's going to eliminate the ones with the lighter colors. There'll still be some that are a little bit lighter than others, okay, but probably over time you will see an increased frequency of the traits that enhance that reproductive success. There will be more of the members of the population that are dark in color than light in color, because they're the ones that survive to reproduce and pass on their genes. Big thing is not only survival of the fittest, which you learned about, but you've got to survive and reproduce to pass on those traits to your offspring for that to be successful. A lot of times we show these hereditary relationships in a cladogram or a phylogenetic tree, a sort of a family tree, okay, that shows where modern species may have evolved from common ancestors. And so here you can see a number of different animals coming from dogs to bears to seals, skunks, red pandas, weasels, and raccoons, okay, all somewhat related. They're all in the order Carnivora, believe it or not, okay, but they didn't all descend from the same, they descended in the far distant past from a common ancestor, but as time goes on you can see that some of these are more closely related to each other than they are to other members of that same family. Okay, so that's evolution as a core theme of biology. All right, so what would be the cause of unequal reproductive success and the effect of that? So pause for a minute, answer that question, and then start up again. All right, we can also connect evolution to our everyday lives, okay? You may or may not realize this, that all dogs are the same species, okay? They all came from the same species, but humans can also contribute to evolution by means of something called selective breeding. It's not just natural selection, but it can be artificial selection as well. And so what people have done to develop these different breeds of dogs and cats and horses and cows and other kinds of animals as well, they choose the offspring from a litter that have characteristics that they want to enhance, and then they breed those individuals with each other to increase the frequency of those genes or those alleles in the population, and that can lead to all these varied different kinds of breeds of dogs and other kinds of animals that look very different from each other even though they belong to the same species. So the next question is, how can humans be agents of both artificial selection and natural selection as well. So stop for a minute and answer that question. Second theme is that life depends on the flow of information, okay? All living things require the transmission of information and the use of that information to take care of processes, okay? The main thing we think of in that terminology is DNA. Okay, DNA is responsible for our heredity. It programs the activities of cells. It provides a blueprint for running things the way they need to be run for the cells and the organism as a whole. There's also information that you get from external and internal environment. Okay, so there are various kinds of stimuli and signals and pathways that regulate body processes. DNA regulates processes by controlling the information flow from the genes in the DNA that code for specific proteins. The code gets copied into RNA, and that RNA is used as a template to make a protein. And the protein might be something as simple as an enzyme to catalyze a certain reaction in the cell, or something more complex in influencing the color of your hair, or whether you have more or less webbing between your fingers or toes. So that's some kind of information that can be transmitted. Other kinds of information have to do with the regulatory body functions, body processes, okay? So like the pancreas gland gets a signal when there's a lot of glucose in the blood to release the enzyme insulin, the hormone insulin. Insulin is necessary in the body cells for the cells to actually open up gates and let the glucose come in that they can use for energy for the cells. And so once the blood glucose level goes down, then there's a feedback mechanism that stops the production of the insulin so that it slows down. So that transmission of information, or the regulatory body processors, definitely involves those chemical signals. Next question: how is signaling information involved in the expression of genetic information? Think about that for a minute, and then come back when you're finished answering the question. The next theme is structure and function. Structure and function are related to each other, okay? You can see that at every level of life. In molecules, the shape of molecule affects how it works. If an enzyme isn't shaped correctly, it's not going to catalyze the reaction that it needs to catalyze, because the molecules won't fit, okay? In cells, okay, you've got things happening in cells. For instance, the nerve cells, as it mentions here, because they're very long, they can transmit impulses all the way from your toes to your spinal cord. Okay, a long distance. So some of the neurons in your body are actually that long, and so structure and function are definitely important and related to each other. In the case of the red panda, here's another thing the red panda has. There's an actual one of the bones in the wrist kind of sticks out differently like that and allows the panda to grasp the bamboo that it eats, okay? They call it a false thumb because it's not really a thumb, but it does help them grasp, because that part of the bone that sticks out there, and you have a sesamoid bone in your wrist as well, yours doesn't stick out like that and make a projection to allow you to grasp things because you have an opposable thumb. So the structure of the red panda's wrist affects its function of being able to hold and eat the bamboo. All right, here's another question. Look at your hand and explain how its structure supports its function. You can look at the various muscles and bones here and the ligaments and see what happens, and see if you can explain how the structure of your hand affects its function. The fourth theme is that life depends on the transfer and transformation of energy and matter. One thing that's really important to understand is that we get all of our energy ultimately from the sun. Okay? Energy flows through an ecosystem, entering as sunlight. It's converted to chemical energy by plants, and then it's passed on to consumers who eat it. and then there's a release of energy in the form of heat. So we always have constantly a new entry of new energy from the sun, and it travels through from the sun to the producers, to the consumers, and then is released as heat. That's one direction all the time. Matter, on the other hand, doesn't do that. We don't get new matter all the time. Matter is what the matter that is here on Earth is all the matter we ever will have, okay? And so we have to recycle the matter all the time. And so ecosystems are characterized by recycling matter from the atmosphere and the soil through the producers and the consumers and the decomposers, and then back to the environment to be used again. And so we have the energy that flows through the ecosystem, whereas the matter is recycled within it. And that's important. That's necessary for life. If we didn't recycle the matter, then the first organisms that evolved would have died because there wouldn't have been any more matter to use. All right, here's another question. Can you describe how photosynthesis transforms energy and matter? This diagram is a good thing to help you. So study that for a minute and pause the video and answer the question. The fifth theme is that life depends on interactions within and between systems. Okay, there have to be all kinds of interactions between them. Some of that has to do with the ecosystem. Okay, we're looking at life from microscopic organisms to the global scale of the living planet. Okay, and as you move from a less complex to a more complex component of the system, you have something called emergent properties. Emergent properties are properties that that exist as a result of the interaction of the parts of a whole. Okay, and so scientists use something called systems biology to model how those biological systems behave by studying the interactions among their parts and then seeing how that produces some kind of a property that emerges from the interaction of those parts. Last question, okay? You have a box of bicycle parts. All right, it won't do anything much because you just got a bunch of parts there. But if you put the parts together properly, you can take a ride. So what would you say this represents, going from the box of parts to the full bicycle? Once you answer this question, that's the end of this section of notes.